Well, thanks very much, Joe, for that nice introduction, and also for the opportunity to be here. It's great to come to UBC, where I've wanted to come for a very long time to see some friends and respected colleagues. And I'm grateful to all of you who've taken time out of your schedules to chat with me today. It's been really enjoyable and fascinating. So we humans are a remarkable species. We exist at densities that way exceed what would be typical for a mammal of our size. We have managed to colonize virtually every region of the terrestrial globe and exhibit virtually unparalleled behavioral diversity in the process. Now, I think we all probably have, at least at some intuitive level, an understanding of how that must have been possible, and that it relates to some degree, in no small part, I think, to our capacity for culture. Now, when I use the term culture, I mean our ability to acquire learned information and skills from other people, to express that knowledge in our tools, our technology, our engineering, our artifacts, and of course to build on it in a cumulative fashion, generation after generation, manufacturing ever more efficient solutions to life's challenges. And right at the heart of that cultural capability is copying, social learning. We humans pick up valuable life skills, as you can see, from our parents and from other important people in our world. And while we might be unusual with respect to the extent of our reliance on social learning, and probably also with respect to the psychological processes that underlie our copying behaviour, the fact that we copy is not in and of itself exceptional. Many other animals will acquire life skills from conspecifics and heterospecifics. I'm sure you're familiar with many of the examples that I'm showing here. Sweet potato washing in Japanese macaques, the pecking open of milk bottles to drink the cream in various species of British birds, the traditional use of various tools by different populations of chimpanzees throughout Africa, and the traditional use of mating sites, schooling sites, resting sites, and traditional pathways through the reef exhibited by many reef fishes. Of course, this is just kind of scratching the surface. There are literally thousands of examples of animal social learning and tradition. Animals are learning what to eat, where to find it, how to process it, how to move safely through their environment, what a predator looks like, how to escape that predator, whom to mate with, whom to fight with, and all kinds of other things by copying conspecifics and heterospecifics. Not just vertebrates, but invertebrates too. And these kind of observations raise a number of questions. But one question has preoccupied me throughout my academic career more so than anything else, and that's the focus of my talk today, which is how can we possibly explain the evolution of the extraordinary human capacity for culture out of its roots in what must be something like the animal traditions that we see manifest in other animals today. And that, of course, is an enormously challenging question. It's not one that I can give you anything like a complete answer to, but I'll try and give you a sketch of what I think might be going on. And it's a sketch based on something like 25 years of theoretical empirical research into the topic carried out by myself and other members of my lab, initially at Cambridge and now at St Andrews. So it's an answer that will come in three parts. I'll begin by trying to convince you that animal social learning is strategic, by which I mean when animals copy, they don't just copy at the first opportunity or any individual they see. Rather, they copy according to rules, and that those rules are to some extent predictable through formal evolutionary theory. I'll then move on to consider whether there might be best way to learn in a complex variable environment, or indeed a best set of rules that animals might deploy under particular circumstances. We address that question by organising a competition. I'll describe the competition, which I think sheds light on why copying is so widespread in nature, and to some extent why humans happen to be so good at it. And then I'll end by describing a series of theoretical projects which I think suggest, to me at least, certain feedback processes that might have been important in human evolution. But let's begin with the strategic nature of animal copying, and with the idea of social learning strategies. Now this is an idea that's based on two bodies of formal theory derived from behavioral ecology and also from cultural evolution. And those bodies of theory have reached the conclusion that individuals ought to be selective with respect to when they rely on social learning and from whom they learn, that natural selection ought to have fashioned specific adaptive rules or social learning strategies, some people call them biases, that dictate the context under which individuals will exploit learned information provided by others. Now, I'm not going to describe that theory. As you can see, it comes from very reputable sources, including one sitting just down here, so I'm sure you can be confident that it's solid. And we'll move on to consider what some of these strategies are. I organise them into sort of intuitive subheadings: when strategies, specifying when it pays the copy, things like copy when asocial learning would be very costly, copy if you're uncertain about what to do, copy if you're dissatisfied with the payoff to your current behaviour. And then there are who strategies, sometimes called model-based biases. For instance, you could copy the majority or conform to the majority view. You could copy prestigious individuals. You could copy the most successful behaviour, or copy in proportion to the demonstrator's payoff. There are many of these rules which have been explored in the theoretical literature. Okay, is that what animals actually do? Well, over the years, I've studied a number of different species of animals. We've investigated social learning in a broad range of taxa. Typically, we don't study animals in their natural environment. That's too messy for me. So we like to bring our animals into captivity, or at least study them in captivity, where we have a little bit more control over their behaviour and the conditions to which they're exposed. And I think it's fair to say, whether we worked with guppies or rats or chickens or callitrichid monkeys or chimpanzees, we pretty much always found evidence for social learning, and more often than not, I think it fits with this idea of strategic copying. Now, I could, I suppose, try to make a case for strategic copying by jumping between different taxa and giving you different examples of animal social learning. I've chosen instead to focus in on a particular case study of social learning in sticklebacks, which has the virtue that it's a kind of coherent example which is relatively well worked, relatively well researched, but which I think is nonetheless pretty much representative of what I think is going on in animal social learning in the broader literature of animal social learning research. So the example concerns public information use in sticklebacks. It's a line of research that was initiated in my lab by Isabelle Coulin, a French postdoc who came out to join me from Canada. She came from University of Quebec at Montreal. And she was interested in the question of whether fish were capable of public information use. So public information use, I should explain, is it has a more specific connotation than might be apparent to you. It doesn't just mean using publicly available information, but rather it refers to the ability of an animal to assess the quality of a resource, such as the richness of a food patch, not by interacting with it directly themselves and sampling it, but rather by monitoring the success and failure of other individuals as they interact with that resource. And some people have suggested that this required some degree of sophisticated cognition on the part of animals. I suspect probably wrongly. But nonetheless, Isabelle at the time was interested in whether fish had this capability. So I sent her out to catch some three-spined sticklebacks from the local rivers and streams around Cambridge. But being trained in working with birds, she didn't know one species of stickleback from another, and came back with two species of sticklebacks. And that's a good illustration of how serendipity can play an important role in science, because we decided to test them both, and the difference between them turns out to be really interesting. I think perhaps the most interesting aspect of this study. So here's Isabelle's apparatus. It's a standard 3-foot aquarium tank. The subject is placed in a central compartment here, from which through transparent partitions it can see two equal-sized shoals of demonstrator conspecifics, each feeding at a feeder, a food patch if you like. And we deliver food to one of these feeders, which we call the rich patch, at 3 times the rate we deliver it to the other feeder, which we call the poor patch. The subject can't actually see the food in the feeders. There are opaque walls to the feeders. It can only tell how much food is in the patches when the demonstrators pull out the food from a little hopper at the base there. So they have to track the success of the demonstrator fish at the two patches, and they do this over a 10-minute observational period. And then the demonstrators remove, all the food is removed from the feeder. We have a 5-minute pause, and then the partitions are lifted, and we see where the subject swims and whether it swims to the former location of the rich goal zone. And what Isabel found was that the 9-spine sticklebacks would swim directly to the rich goal zone. They would swim directly there, and they would spend more time in that goal zone than the alternative goal zone, whereas the 3-spine sticklebacks would swim to each end of the tank at random. Well, one interpretation of that might have been that 9 spines have this capacity for public information use and 3 spines don't. It would have been premature, I think, to have drawn that conclusion at that stage. There are a number of other possibilities we had to rule out. Since these fish were demonstrated to by conspecifics, it's possible that the 9-spine demonstrators, for instance, were more effective at communicating information about the quality of the patches than were the 3-spine demonstrators. So she replicated the study with heterospecific demonstrators. So we have 9 spines demonstrated to 3 spines and 3 spines to 9 spines. Got the same pattern of results as before. Seemingly the 9 spines can solve this, the 3 spines can't. We did wonder whether there might be some crude perceptual difference in these two species of fish. Perhaps the 3 spines couldn't see that far, couldn't see that the conspecifics were feeding. So Isabel replicated the study with a cruder comparison where food was delivered to one patch and not the other. Both species of fish were able to solve that task, so that didn't seem to be the explanation. We did wonder whether there might be residual olfactory cues that these fish were differentially sensitive to. Perhaps the 9 spines could pick them up and the 3 spines couldn't. So she replicated the study with opaque partitions, the only social learning study I know where there's been no visual access to the demonstrators. And neither fish could solve that task, so that wasn't the explanation. What was actually going on came to light when Isabel noticed when she was collecting her fish in the rivers and streams that the 9 spines were much more likely than the 3 spines to be found in refuge. And this gave her an idea for a hypothesis, which I'll tell you in a second, but I'm going to tease you with that for the moment. She tested the hypothesis with a similar experimental setup with a larger compartment, a quarter of which was covered in refuge, a quarter of which is covered in weeds and rocks and stuff. And as well as getting the same basic pattern of results as before, with the 9 spines but not the 3 spines showing public information use like behaviour, she found that while the 3 spines would use the refuge at chance levels, the 9 spines spent a disproportionate amount of time in cover. Since then, my postdoc Mike Webster has been travelling around the world, collecting 9 spines and 3 spines from different populations and assaying them for their public information use capability. I think he's collected nearly 20 populations of each species and tested them. And I think it's fair to say that every single population of 9 spines he's tested, he's found evidence for public information use capability. And he hasn't found it in any of the 3 spine populations at all. 9 spines are always, and 3 spines are never seemingly capable of public information use. Moreover, we found no other ecological or life history or morphological characteristic that co-varies with this public information use capability. It just seems to be a robust species difference. And we brought these fishes into the lab and given them a battery of different asocial and social learning tests, and we found no other differences in their learning ability. 3 spines are capable of other forms of social learning, just not this one. So, here we have 2 closely related species of sticklebacks, sympatric over broad regions of their range, often collected from exactly the same locations, exactly the same rivers and streams, living very similar lifestyles, eating similar foods, and one, the 9-spine sticklebacks, seemingly has a social learning capability that the other lacks. How can we explain that? Well, interestingly, the best explanation that I found comes not from animal behaviour, not from ecology or even comparative psychology, but from anthropology, from the work of Rob Boyd and Peter Richardson, who, on the back of some mathematical theory, proposed a hypothesis that they call their costly information hypothesis, but which for our purposes today is basically the idea that you copy when asocial learning is costly. And that's relevant here because the costs of asocial learning for these 2 fish differ because of differences in their physical defenses, differences in their morphology. These three-spine sticklebacks have these three large spines. They also got heavy-duty plating on their bodies. Robust physical defenses that leave them, at least compared with the nine-spines, comparatively invulnerable to predators. There are these apocryphal stories, I don't know to what extent they're true, that the three-spine sticklebacks have actually survived being eaten. That their spines have got stuck in the throats of predators and they've been coughed up and swum away. Tony's nodding, so it must be true. It's an extraordinary story. What I do know is that there are plenty of experimental studies suggesting that predators of a variety of sort would rather, given a choice, take the nine spines over the three spines. So it would seem the three spines are at least comparatively invulnerable to predators. They can swim around their environment, sampling for themselves at relatively low cost. They don't need to copy. They can get accurate information relatively cheaply on their own. Nine-spine sticklebacks, on the other hand, are much more vulnerable to predators, and so at the slightest hint of a predator, they tend to hide in the refuge. But seemingly, natural selection has fashioned their ability to use that time in refuge profitably by monitoring what other individuals, including heterospecifics, are doing. Indeed, I suspect that's why they're shoaling with the three spines in the first place, such that when the coast is clear, they can swim directly to the rich patch. If that's correct, what we have here is an adaptive specialization in social learning. So a hypothesis that we've been exploring for over 10 years now, and I've not found any evidence that's inconsistent with. And since then, we've been trying to map public information use onto a stickleback phylogeny. This is the latest phylogeny from Kawahara et al. Sorry, I have to keep coming around here to see the screen. So here we have the nine-spine sticklebacks, Pangitius. They, of course, do have this capability. There's the three-spine, Gasterotius achilleatus. They don't. The closest relative to Pangitius is Culea, the brook stickleback. And we've tested half a dozen populations. They seemingly do have this capability, whereas Apparatus, the four-spine stickleback, seemingly does not. We've still yet to test the 15-spine sticklebacks. We'd like to get our hands on some of those. We'd also like to test Wheatlandy. But as it currently stands, the most parsimonious hypothesis would be that this capability probably evolved a few million years ago in the common ancestor of Pangitius and Culea, and that's when we see the appearance of public information use capability. And if that's what's happened, I think it's in a way instructive because it fits with some other evidence to which I could refer, which suggests to me that we're best thinking of the taxonomic distribution of social learning in animals as reflecting specific selection for specific social learning capabilities in distinct lineages, convergent selection, rather than arrayed with taxonomic proximity to humans. But I don't want to give you the impression that nine-spine sticklebacks always copy, because they certainly don't. They're much more savvy than that. So when one of my graduate students at Cambridge, Eike van Bergen, gave these nine-spine sticklebacks the opportunity to sample the two patches themselves over a series of trials and to learn that one patch was rich and the other poor. And then, after a time delay, which she manipulated, gave them the public demonstration and the test. But she played a trick on them. She switched the patches. So what was the rich patch during their personal training became the poor patch in the public demonstration, and vice versa, such that the test is effectively an assay of the extent of their reliance on social or asocial sources of information. When she did that, she found that if these fish got their personal training yesterday, they didn't copy. Okay? So this is the proportion swimming to the rich patch as designated by their personal training. If it was 3 days ago, we see some of them starting to copy. 5 days ago, slightly more of them copying. 7 days ago, they're copying at a level which is no different from individuals that received no personal training. I don't think this is because they're forgetting. We know that sticklebacks can remember for considerably more than a week. Rather, it seems to be some discounting of temporal information, taking account of the challenging and opposing information they're receiving from the demonstrators. And you can devalue that personal training another way by making it noisy. So on the personal training trials, you can make some of those trials, if you consider a particular feeder, the rich feeder overall could not be the rich feeder on that particular trial, and that way you can introduce noise. And what she found was if there was no noise, when they're subsequently given the test, we see no evidence of any copying behavior, a little bit of noise, some copying, a lot of noise, a lot of copying. So these two latter experiments are consistent with these sticklebacks pursuing a copy when uncertain strategy. And in fact, if I had the time, I could show you evidence that 9-spines copying is consistent with a number of alternative social learning strategies, most of which are predicted by formal theory. Not just copy when a social learning is costly or copy when uncertain, but copy in proportion to the demonstrator's payoff, copy the majority behavior or conform, copy larger or older individuals, copy according to reproductive state, and so on and so forth. In other words, these little fish with their tiny brains are not just copying at every opportunity, they're switching between social and asocial sources in a pretty savvy way, depending on the costs and the reliability of the information concerned. And even though, as I say, I haven't really made a case for it in this talk, I suggest to you that that's probably what an awful lot of animals are doing. So let me give you the take-home messages of this first part of my talk then. We've identified what appears to be an adaptive specialization in stickleback social learning. 9-spine but not 3-spine sticklebacks appear capable of exploiting public information, are finding consistently observed across multiple populations. Extensive investigations have revealed no other differences in the learning abilities of these two species. 9-spine's use of public information is strategic and dependent on the quality of personal information. 9-spine copying is consistent with a number of alternative social learning strategies. Specific lineages may have been selected for specific social learning capabilities. And finally, the strategic copying exhibited by sticklebacks, I would suggest, is probably representative of animal social learning in general, although obviously the strategies concerned will vary from one species to the next. Okay, so that's the first part of my talk. So you can imagine having carried out many such experiments and been familiar with a lot of theory along these lines suggesting that animal social learning ought to be strategic. It would lead one to wonder whether there might be a best rule, if you like, a best way of copying, or at least particular kinds of rules that were particularly efficacious under particular circumstances. And while we've been able to explore using formal theory the relative merits of reliance on 1 or 2 or 3 different social learning strategies, I thought it'd be nice if we had a vehicle for comparing large numbers of strategies simultaneously, including strategies that we'd never thought of. And it struck me the situation in which we find ourselves is not dissimilar to the situation faced by Robert Axelrod in the 1970s with respect to a different question, the evolution of cooperation. There, it wasn't clear what the best way to cooperate was, and Axelrod famously, of course, made great headway with respect to that question by organising a tournament, in fact 2 tournaments based around the prisoner's dilemma game, where anybody could send in their strategies, and these were played off against each other in pairwise contests, and as you all know, tit for tat emerged as the winner. And I think this is widely regarded as one of the most innovative pieces of behavioural research of the 20th century. It certainly had a huge impact and was a real shot in the arm for cooperation research. A lot of people were drawn into the field. So I wondered whether we might, in a modest way, sort of be able to do something similar for the field of the evolution of culture. That is, we could come up with a game and other people could enter. They could send in their alternative social learning strategies. We could play them off against each other and see what emerges, see if we could get some truly general insights into the evolution of culture. Fortunately, I managed to get funding for this idea from the EU, and that allowed me to recruit Luke Rendell, trained in Canada, I should say, at Dalhousie, and he did most of the work that I'm going to be describing today. He's the postdoc on this particular project. And we thought it wise to recruit a committee of experts in cultural evolution and game theory to advise us on the structure of the tournament. So we had Rob Boyd, Magnus Enquist, Kim Eriksson and Mark Feldman giving us tips on how best to set up this particular competition. We also had help from Robert Axelrod, Laurel Fogarty and Stefano Gilander. So this was the team. We collectively, over something like 18 months, and went through a number of different iterations of the game that we might set up, and eventually settled on a tournament with the following structure. So it's a multi-arm bandit framework. So I guess you're all familiar with the idea of a one-arm bandit, a fruit machine, where you pull a lever and if you're lucky you get some sort of a payoff. Well, imagine a fruit machine with 100 levers, each with its own characteristic payoff. That would be analogous to the situation faced by hypothetical individuals or agents in our simulated population. There's 100 different behaviours that they could perform. Each has its own payoff drawn from an exponential distribution. So there's a very small number of high payoff behaviours, much larger number of low payoff behaviours. So individuals have to try and work out which of these behaviours to perform. But it's more complicated than that because our bandit is restless, as they say. Payoffs change over time, so you have to track that change in the environment. There's evolution in the simulations through a birth-death process. Individual agents die at random and are replaced by the descendants of other agents that have accrued high fitness in their lives and therefore inherit their parents' strategy unless there's mutation. And the tournament is organised into a series of rounds. On each round, each individual agent has to play one of three possible moves. Innovate, or learn asocially. That allows an individual completely reliably to add a new behaviour to its repertoire and to learn its payoff without error. Secondly, they could observe or copy. They could learn the behaviour of a number of other agents selected at random from those performing behaviour in the previous round and learn the payoff associated with that behaviour, but with error. There could be error with respect to the behaviour. They could essentially get the behaviour wrong, or there could be error with respect to the payoff. They could estimate the payoff associated with the behaviour incorrectly. And these error terms, as well as the number of individuals copied, were parameters that we manipulated. So these are effectively two learning rules. And it's important that agents did, at some stage, learn because they're born naive. They have to build up a behavioural repertoire before they can effectively cash it in and earn any fitness. And they do that through exploiting. That's the third possible move. They can perform a behaviour, but only behaviours in their repertoire, and then they'll get the payoff. It's only that way that they accrue fitness. So when people entered our tournament, they effectively had to specify with their entry, with their strategy, how the agents under their control would utilise these three moves. The final assumption that we made was that individual agents possessed memories, that they remembered the behaviour that they performed and the payoff associated with them. We evaluated the tournament in two phases. There was a round-robin phase where each of the submitted strategies was paired off against another and had repeated opportunities to invade the other. And then the top 10 performers in those pairwise contests went through into a melee phase where all 10 competed simultaneously over a much broader range of simulation conditions. And we designated the strategy with the highest average frequency the winner. We advertised this tournament widely, offering a €10,000 prize, which we hope was sufficient inducement to get lots of people to enter. And we were pleased with the response. We got 104 entries, significantly more than Axelrod got in either of his tournaments. And from 15 different academic disciplines and from 16 countries around the world. And while there were one or two casual entries, the majority were pretty serious. People put a lot of time and effort into this. Frequently, more often than not, in fact, they set up their own simulation environment. They often entered in groups and ran little mini tournaments amongst their groups to work out the best strategy to put forward as a group. Often the entries had quite complex code with neural nets and genetic algorithms and all kinds of other knobs and bells and whistles. Okay, so I'm just going to cherry pick some of the more interesting results that came out of the exercise. So the first thing that we see is a strong negative correlation between the proportion of time invested in either of the learning moves, innovate or observe, and performance in the tournament. In other words, it would seem, at least in the context of this tournament, you can learn too much in life. You know, a sobering lesson for those of us who spend our lives in universities. But on the other hand, if you must learn, then copying seems to be by far and away the more effective means to do this. So what we have here is the proportion of learning moves that were observed as opposed to innovate, and you can see a strong positive relationship. The best performing strategies are those up here who are relying almost exclusively on copying. The timing of learning turned out to be critical. The best performing strategies seem to be able to time bouts of learning to coincide with when there was change in the environment. So I'm showing you these figures are a little bit complex, but what we have here is the performance of the top 10 strategies in the first phase of the tournament. The black line represents the average lifetime payoff. So as you can see, the payoff are doing pretty well, and then there's a drop in the payoff here, and you can see in the red a spike of learning. And that's timed to coincide with when the payoffs drop. So they're doing pretty well, the behavior's fine. And then all of a sudden, the behavior that was working is not working anymore. They engage in a bout of learning. They bring new behavior into their repertoire, but then they stop and they cash in the new behavior that they've acquired. In contrast, the poorly performing strategies showed no statistical correlation between when they learned and the changes in their environment. I'm tempted to say, slightly flippantly, but only slightly, that this is what governments ought to do. They ought to invest in research and development during the lean times, and this is probably what they do. So moving on to the second phase of the tournament, we had our top 10 strategies, which are listed here. And we had a nice clean winner called Discount Machine, shown up here. It was also, incidentally, the best performing strategy in the first round of the tournament, so we were quite pleased that we got a nice, clean result. It was called Discount Machine because it discounted information according to its age, taking account the rate of change in the environment, which it estimated and adjusted its discounting to that parameter. It also projected forward into the future, making sophisticated calculations about the likely utility of the information it had in its behavioral repertoire and whether it was worth investing in further learning, again taking account the rate of change in the environment. This is a strategy that was entered, this is where you can all cheer, of course. This is a strategy that was entered by two Canadians, shown here, Dan Cowden and Tim Lillicrap from Queen's University in Ontario. Very smart guys, very well-deserving winners. Dan was a mathematician, Tim was a computational neuroscientist. And Discount Machine, when it learned, it almost always did so by copying. But it also had a number of other unique features. So we wanted to know to what extent its success in the tournament was attributable to its copying behavior. So in our post-tournament analysis, we produced a mutant version of Discount Machine by playing with their code, where every time it would have copied, it innovated instead. And we reran the melee phase of the tournament to see how it did. It came last. The results are shown in red here. So its success in the tournament is, to no small degree, attributable to its copying behavior. We were also able to play off the original version of Discount Machine against its innovate-only cousin over a broad range of conditions as a kind of means of exploring the relative merits of reliance on social and asocial learning in a relatively smart algorithm. Those results are shown here for one of the parameters, the rate of environmental change. And you can see that copying seems to beat asocial learning over an extraordinarily broad range of parameter space. So what we have here is you have to get a value of the rate of change in the environment around 0.5. This is equivalent to 50% of the behaviors changing their payoff each round. It's a very high rate of environmental change before asocial learning is getting a look in. It does this because it's increasing the mean fitness of individuals in the population. And this really was the extraordinary take-home message of the exercise, I think, which surprised all of us. Even, you know, the Rob Boys and the Mark Feldmans of this world have been working with cultural evolution systems for many decades. That copying seemed to pay under such an extraordinarily broad range of conditions. So, for instance, there's a widely held view within economics, I think, that copying pays because it allows individuals to home in on high payoff behaviors. Now, that might well be true, but we found that we could increase the noisiness of the information that agents got about the payoff to demonstrators to the point where they're essentially getting no information at all. And copying still paid in the sense that the strategies that won out were the ones that were heavily reliant on copying. Similarly, there's a widely held view within psychology that copying is beneficial because it allows you to sample large numbers of individuals simultaneously. But we found we could reduce the number of individuals sampled to just a single individual, and copying still paid in that same sense. The strategies that relied on copying won out. There's a widely held view within the field of cultural evolution that copying can sometimes be disadvantageous because it can lead you to acquire outdated or inappropriate information. But we found that even if it did, more than 50% of the time, it still paid to copy. Even if you're picking up no information at all, more than 50% of the time, it still paid to copy. Why? Well, I think copying pays in our tournament because individual agents filter behavior, rendering adaptive information available for other agents to copy. So when people entered our tournament, they programmed the agents under their control, according to their strategies, to sort of build up a behavioral repertoire and then to perform the behavior in their repertoire associated with the highest payoff. I mean, why not? They wanted to win the tournament, right? But what that meant was that when other agents copied, they weren't obviously copying from a random subset of behaviors, they're copying from a highly select subset of high performance behaviors. And that, I think, is why copying is so widespread in nature, probably. That's why we see copying behavior not just in chimpanzees or Japanese macaques, but in Drosophila melanogaster, or in crickets, or in many, many other invertebrates. In other words, you don't have to be smart to copy. Even random, mindless copying will very frequently give you a leg up relative to trial and error learning. But on the other hand, if you can copy in a savvy way, in a rule-governed way, in a strategic way, there are fitness advantages to do that. Let's think about some of the population level aspects of this copying behavior. So in these figures, we have the proportion of learning that is observe as opposed to innovate. So at this end of the spectrum, we've got individuals who are relying on social learning. At this end, we've got asocial learning. And this is the amount of behavior in the behavioral repertoires of the entire population. And you can see that there's a positive relationship. You increase the amount of copying goes on, and the repertoire of the population goes up. Now, ostensibly, this doesn't make sense at all. It's only through innovation that you can bring new behavior into the population. Copying doesn't introduce new behavior, and yet we're seeing this positive relationship. And this is real. This is not a result of the fact that we've got selection between different strategies going on or, or some other artifact. Even if you've just got a single strategy involved which you manipulate experimentally, and there's no evolution possible between strategies, you still get this positive relationship. It reflects the fact that, yes, while increasing the amount of copying necessarily reduces the amount of innovation, therefore reduces the amount of new behavior coming into the population, it also reduces the likelihood that old behavior will be lost. And it has a bigger effect on the loss than the gain. So it's effectively increasing the gain to loss ratio, and hence you get this positive result. But similarly, if you look at the amount of behavior actually performed, you see a negative relationship. More copying, fewer behaviors are performed, but of course populations are converging on very high performance adaptive solutions. So you get, at least at population level, some semblance of conformity emerging in the behavior of the population. Here we're considering the persistence of knowledge in the behavioral repertoires of the entire population. You increase the amount of copying going on, and you seem to hit some threshold above which all of a sudden we see behaviors hanging around for very long periods of time. The average lifetime of an agent in our simulations is 50 rounds. So actually you can think of these numbers as not dissimilar from human years. So we're getting something equivalent to knowledge being around for thousands and thousands of human years. But that, if we look at that, in spite of the fact that if we look at what's going on at the behavioral level, the behavior is actually being performed, we're seeing as we increase the amount of copying, more and more rapid turnover in the rate of change of populations, kind of akin to fads or fashions or rapid changes in technology. So you imagine that if we had selection amongst our ancestors for increasing reliance on copying, and I suggest the mechanism by which we might get that later, then certain things would come with that. We'd see bigger behavioral repertoires, we'd see some semblance of conformity, we'd see cultural knowledge persisting for long periods of time, and we'd see rapid changes in cultural turnover. So let me summarize the take-home messages from the second part of my talk then. Copying pays because other individuals filter behavior, making adaptive information available for others. Efficient copying, by which I mean strategic copying, typically increases mean fitness. Copy error, either getting the wrong behavior or if copying fails completely, unless it's really extreme, typically does not detract from the value of copying. Copying pays irrespective of the number of individuals copied or whether there's information about payoff. Successful strategies restrict learning and maximize exploiting. They time copying for when payoffs drop. And they evaluate current information based on its age and judge how valuable it will be in the future. So I think these early findings probably help us to understand why copying is so widespread in nature. And these later findings probably have more to say about why humans happen to be so good at copying. Because I suspect it's probably only in humans that we have the mental wherewithal to be able to gauge in the kind of algorithms exhibited by the most successful strategies in the tournament. Finally, copying seems to confer an adaptive plasticity on populations, allowing them to respond to changing environments rapidly, drawing on a deep knowledge base. Okay, so that's the second part. In the last 10 minutes or so, I'll describe some feedback mechanisms that I think might be operating. The first of these is a study carried out by Simon Reeder, who was at the time a graduate student of mine at Cambridge. Excuse me. And Simon established a relationship between social learning and brain size in primates. What he did was he worked his way through quite literally thousands of different primate behavior articles, collecting reports of social learning and behavioral innovation in different species of primates, attributed them to different species, and looked to see whether there was a relationship with various different measures of brain size. And obviously, if you do a study like this, there are all kinds of different biases that might be distorting that relationship. You need to obviously take account of the fact that some species are studied more than others. Obviously, species are not independent. You have to take account of phylogeny and a number of other potential biases. But when he did all that, he found a positive relationship between the amount of social learning going on in a given species of primate and the size of its brain. And similarly, the amount of innovation. So in other words, big-brained species of primates seem to copy more and seem to invent more new behavior than do small-brained species of primates. These relationships hold up when you put them through independent contrasts. And this observation led us to endorse an argument originally put forward by Berkeley molecular evolutionist Alan Wilson, which he called his behavioral drive hypothesis. This was the idea that the ability to invent new behavior and to copy the inventions of others, to copy the good ideas of others, would give individuals an advantage in the struggle to survive and reproduce. And assuming that these abilities have some basis in neural substrate, this, Wilson argued, would generate selection for larger and larger brains, culminating, of course, in ourselves, the species the most innovative, the most reliant on social learning and culture, having the largest relative brain size. Well, I think there's something to that argument. Might well be a plausible argument. This data is certainly consistent with it, at least. The only caveat I would say is I don't think we're likely to be seeing selection for more and more social learning, because as we've seen, there's no reason to think intrinsically that social learning requires any smarts. Rather, probably what's going on is we're seeing selection for more and more efficient or more strategic forms of social learning, and that's incidentally manifesting greater amounts of copying behaviour. A second study which has influenced my thinking is something I carried out with Magnus Enquist and Pontus Strimling at Stockholm University. This is a cultural evolution study, the details of which don't really concern us here today. All I want you to take away is the shape of these functions. So what we have here is plotted the longevity of a cultural trait plotted against the fidelity of cultural transmission, the accuracy with which information is passing from the demonstrator to the observer. And look at the shape of these curves. As you increase the size of the population, you'll get an increasingly steep takeoff in these functions. So what that means is a small increase in cultural fidelity makes a big difference, firstly, to how long a given cultural trait stays in the population, and secondly, as a knock-on consequence of that, how much culture a population of a given size can support. You can imagine that if we did have selection in this dimension for higher fidelity copying, and as I said, we have reason to think from formal theory that might be operating, then that would automatically bring with it an increase, a significant increase in the amount of culture and more long-lasting culture. And of course, more culture and more long-lasting culture potentially creates greater opportunities for cumulative culture, because you certainly can't have cumulative knowledge gain and refinements and improvements on cultural traits if they don't stick around for very long. Now, I'm presenting this as a verbal argument today, but we are actually doing some analytical theory in my lab, and the early signs are that this particular argument is going to stand up. That, I think, probably helps us to understand why chimpanzees have, at the last count, something like 39 different cultural behaviours, whereas we humans have how many? What, in the millions, in the billions? Too many to count. Teaching, I think, is one mechanism by which we can achieve this higher fidelity information transmission. This, I think, has probably been an important development in the lineage leading to humans. We humans teach widely. Until recently, it was thought that animals didn't teach. Of course, they learn from each other, but the learning does not require any particular effort on the part of the demonstrator. It's not actively going out its way to invest in the knowledge gain on the part of the pupil. But recently, there have been a spate of reports of teaching in a variety of species of animals, in ants, in bees, in meerkats, in pied babblers, but interestingly not in chimpanzees or gorillas or orangutans or dolphins or some of the more celebrated cerebral mammals. So we wondered how we can make sense of this seemingly bizarre taxonomic distribution, and asked Pontus Strimling and Laurel Fogarty, postdoc and graduate student in my lab respectively, to develop a mathematical model exploring the evolution of teaching, which they did, the results of which we're showing here. So what we have on this y-axis here is the fitness difference between a teaching genotype and a non-teaching genotype. So where these coloured lines go above this dashed line, that means that teaching would invade a population of non-teachers, and as it turns out, would go to fixation. And what we have on this x-axis is the probability of acquiring the taught information through other means, through asocial learning or through inadvertent social learning, through just copying. And what we found was that, so at this end of the spectrum, we have relatively easy to learn things that could be acquired through asocial learning and social learning. And here teaching is not supported. Why? Well, because there's no point in teaching what are typically your kin to acquire knowledge at some cost to yourself if they're going to acquire that essentially on their own without your efforts. Teaching doesn't pay there. Equally, teaching doesn't pay for very difficult to learn things either, for a different reason. Here, the knowledge is rarely present in the population at sufficiently high frequency to be available to teachers to pass on to their pupils. And there's no point in paying the costs associated with teaching if you haven't got any cool stuff to pass on. So you end up with a window of tasks of relatively of intermediate kind of difficulty that potentially support teaching. And the breadth of that window depends on the fitness advantage to the taught information. But it turns out that fitness advantage has to be pretty high for teaching to invade, which is why I think teaching is relatively rare in animals. So how do humans get around that? How can we teach so widespread? Well, as people like Joe have emphasized for many years, humans have cumulative culture. And one property of cumulative culture is that individuals can have information at their disposal, indeed at their disposal to pass on through teaching, that they could not have invented for themselves. We have information in our populations that no individual could possibly invent. And if we develop an extension to our model which allows for cumulative cultural learning, sure enough we find that it broadens the range of conditions under which it pays to teach. And it does so precisely because it increases the amount of information within the population, thereby making it more likely that teachers will have that information to pass on. Teachers can pass on those difficult to learn, high fitness behaviours to their pupils. Finally, one last study. So I'll begin with an observation that stems from a piece of work by Mark Feldman and Luca Cavalli-Sforza, which is that high-fidelity cultural transmission can promote gene culture coevolution. So Feldman and Cavalli-Sforza modelled the relationship between the spread of the gene for adult lactose absorption and the spread of a cultural trait of dairy farming. What's of interest here is that the critical variable in determining whether the gene spread within the population was the probability that children of dairy product users themselves became milk consumers. In other words, it was the fidelity of cultural transmission. That turns out to be, I think, a fairly robust finding in these gene culture coevolution models. Well, initially, of course, people thought of this case of dairy farming lactose absorption as a really interesting example, a classic example of gene culture coevolution, but very much, I think, as a special case. Recently, I think people started to wonder whether gene culture coevolution might not be much more widespread than we'd hitherto thought. This change in perspective has been initiated, I think, by a bunch of studies by mathematically and statistically minded geneticists who've developed means for detecting genes in the human genome, alleles in the human genome that have been subject to recent rapid selection. They're finding a sufficiently large number of these, many hundreds of regions of the genome that have been subject to recent selection. Some people think as many as 2,000 genes might be involved. But what's interesting is that when we look at what's known about the functionality of these genes and try to draw inferences about what the sources of selection might be, the geneticists themselves are pointing to human cultural practices as a potential source of selection. Things like our aggregation into large numbers, which promoted the spread of crowd diseases and led to selection of alleles that confer resistance. Our domestication of plants and animals, which expose us to animal pathogens and zoonoses, and again led to genes that have conferred some resistance. Our planting crops, which again inadvertently promoted disease and led to alleles that conferred resistance. Our culturally induced changes in diet, which are selected for alleles that confer some ability to process and metabolize the novel protein or carbohydrates or lipids or whatever you think. So with my colleagues, John Odling-Spee and Sean Miles, we collated this information in a recent article. So what you have here are something like over 100 genes that have been subject to recent selection, people think, and the inferred cultural selection pressure. Now, I think the way to think about this data set is these are hypotheses, right? Every one of them could be a case of gene culture coevolution, but a lot more work has got to be done. You know, the equivalent amount of work has been done on dairy farming and lactose before we can say for sure whether they are a case of gene culture coevolution. But what this does, I think, is raise it as a very serious possibility. I think it's highly plausible. So I'm going to end with a theoretical study, which is a bit of a departure for me, which is using a cellular automaton model, a spatially explicit model of gene culture coevolution, but which was inspired by the observation that many of these kinds of data that we're thinking about in humans are kind of dependent on space. So what we have here is 20 by 20 toroidal grid, if you like. So this is a population of 400 individuals. Each one little square. There are black squares as well as white squares, so you can't see them, but each one is an individual physically located in space, and the light colours represent its possession of a cultural practice, a particular cultural niche constructing practice, something like planting a crop, for instance, or domesticate an animal or something like that. And the corresponding region of this panel represents the amount of resource in the population modified by its cultural activity. So that might be, for instance, the amount of standing water that's affected by the crop planting activity. And what we have here in this panel is its genotype, where different colours represent different genotypes, and the light colours represent a genotype, big ABA in this case, which is favoured in the resource-rich conditions. If you like, you can think of it as the classic case of yam cultivation, standing water, and sickle cell allele, which responds. And we'll have the global frequencies here. So as I start this little simulation running, initially these genotypes and phenotypes are completely randomly distributed in space. What happens is, by chance, we'll get a cluster of individuals engaged in this cultural practice. This will lead to a concentration of resource in that region, generating selection for the genotype, which is favoured in these resource-rich conditions. But what happens, because of the spatial structure, because individuals mate and reproduce locally, statistical associations build up between the cultural practice and the genotype that's favoured as a result of that practice. And provided these clusters reach a critical threshold size, then they will typically increase. And the cultural practice will hitchhike to fixation on the back of the selection it generates. It will drive itself to fixation. You can take that one stage further by introducing a second genetic locus, completely unlinked to the first. Oh, we lost it. What's happened? Oh, I'm sorry. That was probably me stepping all over this stuff. So what I could say is, in the first case, the hitchhiking effect that we see occurs under a broad range of conditions, at least with respect to the dimensions we've explored. So even if there's a fitness cost to the cultural trait, even if there's a cost to the genotype, irrespective of whether there's vertical transmission or oblique transmission, or at least to some degree. If you have too much oblique relative to vertical transmission, then it starts to break down. But provided the transmission is relatively local, then this occurs under a remarkably broad range of conditions. And I just really had one more slide, so I guess I could talk you through. Oh, is it back? Okay. So what we have here, I'll step more carefully this time. So what we have here is a second genetic locus that I've introduced, and this represents any genetic variation that might affect the potency of the cultural trait. So it enhances the efficiency of the social learning, the accuracy of the social learning, make it more strategic or something like that. So once again, let's start this simulation running. This is a 60 by 60 grid, but essentially it's the same dynamics. We get concentration of niche constructors engaging this cultural practice in a particular region, increasing the amount of resource, generating selection for the favoured genotype that thrives in that resource-rich environment, hitchhiking to fixation on the back of the selection it generates. But look what's happening here too. Any genetic variation that potentially increases the potency of that cultural practice is kind of mopped up in this hitchhiking process, and it too is increasing in frequency. Now, that secondary hitchhiking happens under a far less broad range of conditions, but nonetheless, it suggests the possibility in my mind that these niche constructing traits, these human cultural niche constructing traits, could be generating some feedback process that's relevant to our understanding of human evolution by driving themselves to fixation, and in the process potentially extending their potency. Now, talking with Michael Whitlock yesterday, he convinced me that there's something slightly unusual about the spatial structure that we are assuming in these cellular automata models, and that we probably need to, before we draw too strong a conclusion on the basis of these analyses, to try and relax the assumption and allow for more extended and more naturalistic patterns of dispersal. I think that's a fair criticism. But nonetheless, it suggests to me that there might be something really quite interesting about this mechanism, and it's worthy of further exploration. So to sum up then, I think it may be possible to understand the evolution of human culture as the product of a number of feedback mechanisms. Strategic copying, such as utilizing mental time travel or payoff-based copying or conformity, promotes social learning efficiency. The ability to invent new solutions and to copy the solutions of others may have generated selection for enhanced perceptual and cognitive capabilities, leading to bigger brains. Small increments in both the reliance of social learning and the fidelity of cultural transmission can lead to big increases in the amount and duration of culture. Teaching and cumulative culture may have co-evolved, since each increases the utility of the other. And finally, cultural niche construction may have modified selection in the human lineage, selecting for enhanced cultural capabilities. That's it. I would like to thank a whole bunch of people who've helped me in the many studies that I'm describing. Too many to name, really. My funders and you for your attention. Thank you.
You should go back one slide and leave the rest of the floor. Nice. Kev, you can just take your own questions.
Okay. Yeah.
I really liked your talk. I thought it was amazing. Re your tournament. I was wondering what would happen if you, instead of having the melee phase with every strategy, rebranded with monocultures of each of the strategies. Because the discount machine is sort of parasitic in a way, and that it might be dependent on the existence of the innovators to overcome fluctuations in the environment. Yeah. Have you guys considered doing something like that?
Yeah, we did it. Yeah, and so what happens is, as you might anticipate, we get, if you just have each of those 10 strategies playing against itself, you get exactly negative correlation between their performance in the tournament and their performance when playing on their own. The discount machine comes 10th. So clearly there's a frequency-dependent interaction that's going on. Discount machine is kind of exploiting the good ideas that the other strategies are bringing into the population. But we have this complication that novel behavior can come in through copy error too. So it's not just innovation that's the source of novelty. And so discount machine can thrive even in many environmental conditions, even though it's not necessarily introducing new behavior through innovation.
You mentioned that social learning is copying both conspecific and heterospecific, and you showed that with the sticklebacks. I was wondering how much phylogenetic diversity can span through heterospecific copies. I mean, obviously, fish can copy fish, but how much diversity do you see before they really can't copy each other's behaviors and it's not applicable?
Well, I think you pretty much see it in any pair of species that aggregate together. So if you've got primates that hang out together, they copy each other. We see that in callitrichid monkeys, for instance, and in lemurs. Similarly, I would expect in flocks of birds, if you've got mixed species flocks, you're likely to see them copying off each other. So I think it's more to do with the social interactions and what leads the species to aggregate in mixed species aggregations in the first place. But once they're there, you might as well utilize the information they potentially provide.
Are there circumstances under which it's valuable to hide what you are providing by way of information?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I should say we're planning a second tournament, and one of the things we discussed at some length is whether it might be beneficial under some circumstances to deceive others, and whether there might be benefits to individuals to hiding information and so on and so forth. There's not a huge amount of evidence for this going on in nature. The only study I can think of I mean, leaving humans to one side. The only study I can think of occurs in some mollies. Is it Amazonian mollies or Atlantic mollies? Atlantic mollies, I think, where they have a mate choice copying system. So males will copy the mate choices of other males. And that, of course, opens up the possibility of sperm competition if you're copied. So there's a nice study which showed that if you give a male a preference between two females, he makes his choice, and then you introduce another male that can watch him courting, he actually switches his preference and starts wooing the other female, seemingly to mislead the other male into courting the other one, so he can, in time go and woo his favoured female. Very interesting observation. I don't know how much of that kind of thing is going on in nature. Yeah.
In your analysis of teaching, did you take into account, it wasn't quite clear, the risk of learning a behavior imperfectly? Some behaviors, we're very familiar with lots of behaviors that are risky if done badly. It would seem that those are the ones in which learning is a particular thing.
So in all three forms, there are three forms of knowledge acquisition. In no case is that perfect. So it's error prone in every respect. But so there's the issue of how perfect the learning is, but there's also the issue of how costly the learning is, and we have costs as well as unreliability built into our models. Yeah.
When you were talking about copying versus innovation, it reminded me of some work I read a long time ago. I think it was actually done in the 1960s for observational work on monkey colonies. And they found that innovative behavior occurred on the fringes of the colony and not in the center. So did you, in any of the studies, introduce like a social status, standing, competition kind of variable for your payoff?
We didn't have any hierarchy in our tournament. That's another interesting point. There were various ways in which you could relax the assumptions of our tournament. I think it was sensible to start with a very simple tournament structure to try and draw as many people in to participate as possible. Having done that, and we're going to run another tournament now, we're thinking about what would be a sensible way to develop it. One way is to allow individual identities, so that would allow for things like differences in rank or the ability to assess whether an individual is particularly prestigious or is related to you, so you can eventually keep track of the identities of other individuals and how successful they've been. Another potential extension is to bring in some degree of population structure. And a third innovation that we're introducing is to allow the possibility of cumulative culture. We don't know how many more tournaments the public is willing to engage in, so we thought we'd put all our eggs in one basket and try and deal with all three things in one go. But I think you're right, actually. There are differences, rank-based differences, associated with things like innovation. When we've looked at patterns of innovation in non-human primates, we do find a tendency for lower status individuals to be disproportionately likely to introduce new behaviour into populations. So that does seem to be a pattern.
Did you have any, so it seems like with this approach, the big question is how you cross the threshold, the barrier to cumulative cultural evolution. And given the relatively poor performance of non-human primates compared to other species, how do we have any thoughts on that riddle?
Yeah, so towards the end, I suggested that there might be some sort of conceptual link between teaching and cumulative culture. We have another reason for thinking that, which is an empirical study that we have just carried out, which is designed to assess the ability of the animals concerned to engage in cumulative cultural learning. So this is a puzzle box that can be solved at 3 different levels to get ever more desirable food returns. So you have to solve it at the lowest level to get the opportunity to access the second level, and so on and so forth. And we presented this puzzle box to groups of children chimpanzees and capuchin monkeys. We had about 8 groups of each. And we didn't really expect to see cumulative cultural learning in the chimpanzees or the capuchin monkeys. Our goal rather was to say, okay, there are a number of hypotheses in the literature as to why we might not see cumulative culture in chimpanzees and other animals. Let's try and collect the data which allow us to evaluate which of these hypotheses is correct. So sure enough, we found no evidence for cumulative cultural learning in the chimps and the capuchins. But when we looked at the various hypotheses that seem to be explaining the performance, we see strong evidence for cumulative learning in the kids. What we found is 4 hypotheses were supported. What they have in common is that all were proposed by Michael Tomasello. And he's been banging about these things for a very long time, that humans uniquely have an extreme reliance on imitation, that they have a capacity to teach through verbal instruction, and that there's a lot of altruistic behavior that you see in humans which you don't see in other animals. And this is exactly what we find in our study. We see evidence for extensive teaching in the kids, we see evidence for imitation in the kids, we see evidence through verbal instruction in the kids, and we see a lot of spontaneous gift giving in the kids. They get a reward and they give it to another kid. And moreover, the performance that individual children reach, their performance in this exercise is exactly predicted with regressions by how much teaching they received, how much imitation they engaged in, how many pro-social acts they benefited from, how much verbal instruction they got. So really is strongly consistent with Tomasello's argument. And this is, again, a sort of another link in my mind between teaching and cumulative culture. And given that every single instance of teaching we saw involved some verbal instruction, it wouldn't surprise me if language is wrapped up in that dynamic too. But I usually still steer well clear of talking about the evolution of language because it's too dangerous a topic to get into.
So I'm still confused as to why primates don't teach. So you showed these, these models, there's a window. Why? They live in very complex environments. They've got long memories. They've got all these things. Why ants?
They're also very, very good at learning. They're very good at asocial learning. They're very good at social learning. Yeah. So the difference between us and... So the fact that they're good at social learning and asocial learning means that there are fewer circumstances in which there is additional benefit to be gained by teaching. Okay? So what cumulative culture does is it introduces these complex behaviors which are hard to pass on, which are hard to acquire asocially, hard to pick up through just plain copying, where there's real fitness benefits associated with these behaviors, but you really need something like verbal instruction in order to get those behaviors across. And I suspect that most of the time in other primates, there's not the fitness benefits associated with investing in teaching.
Just following up on these questions, another hypothesis about why cumulative culture in the human case, but not another species, is the idea of population densities. That you have to cross this threshold of enough of a population where cultural learning becomes really it starts to pay off. But I thought you said in your tournament study, number of models to copy from did not matter that much. Is that what you said?
It did not matter in the sense that it still paid to copy. It didn't affect the dynamics of whether it paid to copy as opposed to asocial learning. But I mean that's not a hypothesis. That hypothesis, I think you're guessing you're referring to Adam Powell's argument in his recent paper. I think that's a very plausible argument. I mean, I guess Joe's made similar points, right? The demography, I think, is likely to be very, very important with respect to the dynamics. I think that certain things have to be in place, though, before that can kick in. So you obviously need a capacity for cultural learning. These kind of models assume the prior existence of cultural learning, and probably cumulative cultural learning through sophisticated social learning mechanisms such as imitation or teaching before you can get that kind of thing taking off. But it wouldn't surprise me if that then allows further opportunities for greater investment in cumulative cultural learning. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you found or heard of any effect of joint attention on teaching or social learning in primates.
So I guess we can see evidence for this kind of thing in humans, and a lot of the evidence for teaching amongst very young children or of very young children involves these very subtle pedagogical cues that parents will give to their kids. They'll effectively send the message through their body language to pay attention to this thing as opposed to that thing. And there are these studies in non-human primates suggesting some level of joint attention and pedagogical cueing, but the level seems to be, far less. I mean, I think this is, for me, a very general observation. We can sometimes, when we study, say, a chimpanzee, we can see evidence for imitation, we can see evidence for some kinds of referential communication, we can see some features of theory of mind and so on and so on and so forth. But when you actually put them side by side with what's going on in humans, there seems to be a vast quantitative difference, which in some people's minds is equivalent to a qualitative difference.
Anything else? Great.
Thank you.